Thanks everybody for joining today's webinar, Innovation Hubs in MedTech and BioTech, Space, Place, and Trends, presented by Ryan Companies. My name is Tyler Mason. I'm the Digital Media Manager at Medical Alley. We're excited to have you join us today for a conversation that I think is going to be relevant to a lot of folks in this chat. We've got a pretty good expertise on the panel here from some different parts of the industry, so we'll introduce them in just a moment. I just want to go over a couple housekeeping items for today's webinar. First of all, this webinar is recorded, so if you're not able to stay for the whole time, that's okay. We'll send you a recording of it. You're also able to share it with your colleagues or anyone else who might be interested. For the Q&A today, we're going to save some time at the end, about 10 to 15 minutes for Q&A. Put your questions in the Q&A function in the Zoom chat here, not the chat function. So we'll be monitoring the Q&A throughout. We'll save time at the end for that as well. If anyone has questions in the meantime, you can put them in the Q&A, but again, we'll save those for the end here. So I'm going to turn it over to today's moderators, Jackie Christopher and Adam Burrington from Ryan Companies, and I'll let the two of you take it away.
Thank you, Tyler, for the introduction, and welcome to those of you who have joined today. The purpose of the panel discussion today is to look at the role of space and place in fostering growth and innovation for MedTech and life sciences companies. The experts we've invited to be a part of this discussion have a deep understanding of how locations, facilities, and design have the power to drive innovation and growth for today's MedTech and biotech users. My name is Jackie Christopher, and I'll be moderating this panel with my colleague, Adam Burrington. Adam and I both work for Ryan Companies. I am the director for our National Build-A-Suit Development Team, and in that role, I focus on multi-market industrial development opportunities across the United States. Our team focuses on MedTech, life sciences, advanced manufacturing, aviation, data centers, and warehouse and distribution, partnering with our clients to bring the real estate solutions that match their need.
Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Adam Burrington. I'm the National Director of Project Development for Ryan Companies in our life sciences and advanced technology verticals. I focus on leveraging my experience in integrated project delivery and the unique business operations of the life science industry to help clients strategically grow their operations through real estate design and construction solutions, bridging the gap between creativity and constructability while enhancing project performance and reducing cost. Jackie?
So as I mentioned, we both work for Ryan Companies, and just a little bit about Ryan. We're a comprehensive commercial real estate firm with service lines including development, capital markets, construction, architecture and engineering, and property management. Our key sectors include, as mentioned, life sciences, industrial, healthcare, and data centers, but also retail, multifamily, and senior living. We're headquartered in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and have 17 regional offices around the country. And now on to the introduction of our panelists. Adam, do you want to start?
Yeah, first we have Matt Lewis. Matt Lewis is Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at the Greater MSP Partnership. In his role, Matt builds teams comprised of leaders from many different organizations, all working to grow the Greater Minneapolis-St. Paul region's economy. After several years of leading implementation of MSP's region's first economic development strategy in areas like talent attraction and venture capital, Matt led the effort to build Minnesota's MedTech 3.0, which earned a U.S. Tech Hub designation late last year.
All right, and our next panelist is Dan Mueller. Dan is Vice President of Real Estate Development for Ryan and specializes in developing real estate solutions for some of the nation's most innovative medtech companies. He has a track record of successfully completing complex deals with recent projects including the development of the Boston Scientific Campus in Maple Grove, Minnesota, Kindeva Drug Delivery in Woodbury, Minnesota, and Calder Products in Roseville, Minnesota.
Next, we have Jessica McGilka. Jessica serves as Executive Vice President on JLL's Minneapolis Tenant Representation Team. With more than 17 years of real estate strategy and execution experience globally, Jessica's expertise is aligning business strategy with real estate by supporting the full life cycle of real estate decisions. She is the co-leader for the Life Science Practice Group at JLL and works with life science companies to connect unique business needs to real estate.
Okay, and our fourth panelist is Paul Erickson. Paul is a principal and project manager on life science and other research facility types at AEI. As AEI's building performance practice leader, he guides the firm's sustainable design services and champions high performance design on projects around the country. His recent projects have been all electric designs, including some set to achieve net zero energy and net zero operational carbon. So thank you to our panelists for being here today. Adam, let's kick off the first question.
This is really for the entire group to kind of kick things off, and we'd like you to comment on national trends and how we see them applied to the local market. Matt, do you want to start us off?
Sure. I'll turn to others that might have even greater kind of expertise, I think, in the industry. But one thing I'll start with is for context. So Greater MSP, as was mentioned, is an economic development partnership. So it's a partnership of cities and counties and companies and universities and foundations all working to grow this economy. And one of the core functions of Greater MSP is anytime a company is looking to expand, do business, potentially relocate in our region, and we're being compared to other regions across the country and the world. That's where we kind of step in to speak with one voice as one team on behalf of this region. And over the course of the dozen years that Greater MSP has been in existence, the kind of largest concentration of deals that our region has won that we've worked on have been in the medical technology space, dozens of different projects. And what we tend to see is a lot of the decision factors, why companies are deciding on this region. You look at national trends, and in many ways, our region is going to go with the flow of the economy, but in other areas, we're going to really stand out, and I think we'll dig into that today. So when it comes to things like trends in venture capital or private equity markets, we're not immune to those things. When it comes to trends of kind of the tightening of the workforce and labor market, right? You see those things playing out here very similarly. When you see trends in the crunch for space, and then maybe it easing up a bit, we'll get into that again today. It looks very similar here. So what I'd say is I think overall, and you'll see as Jessica and others that can cite kind of reports that their organizations have published, especially in the medical technology industry, when you see something playing out across the country, it tends to be playing out pretty similarly here. One thing I would, I guess, add is the kind of concentration of assets in this space. It's been true for some time, and it still is today. So some kind of foundational things to know, depending on where you're tuning in from across the country. This is the number one concentration of medical kind of device manufacturing in the country. When I say concentration, that's kind of like looking, per capita at the amount of activity that's here. 15 of the 20 largest medical device companies in the world have a presence in Minnesota. 10 of them operate either their global or divisional headquarters here. And so you tend to see, a very, very high concentration of tens of thousands of professionals working in the industry. So as trends kind of go in the industry, so goes it here. But I'll stop there with the kind of level setting, and maybe we could turn it to others that can get into the specifics of what they've seen over the last couple of years and right now.
Thanks, Matt. Jessica, could you chime in and give some context there too in terms of trends?
Yeah, absolutely. So Matt kind of teed it up really well for me. So thank you. I would say one of the big trends that we're seeing nationally, at least, is a bifurcation between coastal markets and the rest of the company, or the country rather. One of the key pieces to that was our 2023 Life Sciences report for JLL focused. We've had this whole conversation going around. We don't get to hit the easy button in this particular market, in the MSP market. We don't get to say pharma equals lab equals life science. In biotech only, we care about labs, and that's what we're talking about only. And so we added to our life science report who and where the big clusters of medical device and bioindustrial manufacturing. And for device, we came in a hair behind Orange County in California, which, a couple of phone calls may have been made and some discussions had about whether or not that should be true. But the bifurcation of some of those trends are also what we're seeing nationally. So nationally, we're seeing a real oversupply in lab product and certain really specific life science, GMP, CGMP kinds of product. And we're seeing a reshuffling of all of that supply that is starting to result in less products coming online after this year. So after 2024, we're seeing a national trend, especially on the coast specifically, that the market will have a moment to absorb some of that product. And a lot of green shoots around, and what Matt referenced around funding and VC funding and IPOs and more money in capital markets coming into the space, which is, a fundamental underpinning of real estate demand. Here in the Twin Cities, we have an amazing supply of flex space, and we can talk a little bit more about that as we go. But medical device being one of our core markets is an incredibly important piece of it. And all of this kind of leads to my favorite 2024 trend, which is everything is hyper local. So this side of town might be seeing this, and that side of town might be seeing something else. And that tracks across the country, across the world, and in the Twin Cities.
Great. And I would ask Dan, how does that match up with what you're seeing in terms of build-to-suit interest from some of the larger users?
Yeah, I'd add on to a few things Matt and Jessica said. I think you touched on something really important, Jessica, related to who we are as a market and our just propensity for flex space. And I think globally speaking, life science and med tech generally fall under the industrial, like big picture umbrella in this market anyways, not necessarily on some of the coasts where there's some more dense, vertical mixed use type of spaces. But, you can't really talk about the health of the med tech environment in this market without talking about just the overall health of the industrial market. And, over the last, call it 12 months, given the interest rate uncertainty, call it, there's been a rapid slowdown in new construction deliveries on the speculative side, which has, led to a tightening in overall space and vacancy. And we've seen more build-to-suit activity because of that. And I do think, looking forward, we'll get into the trends and predictions later on. But I think with some more stability in the interest rate market, a little bit of a healthy reset in terms of supply and demand for kind of your bread and butter industrial space, that'll help balance things out moving forward.
Points. So, Matt, I'm going to go back to you to give a little background on the MedTech Hub project. So, those of us who are in this space and who live in Minnesota, we've heard about this, we've read about it in the news, but we've got an audience that's coming to us from around the country and even around the world. So for their benefit, can you explain a little bit about what this distinction meant and where it's going?
Sure. So a little over a year and a half ago, the CEO at Medtronic, Jeff Martha, had come forward to the kind of greater MSP partnership, kind of on behalf of not just his company, but the industry and his peers, to say, there are other regions, states, countries around the world that certainly aspire to be the global innovation hub in medical technology that Minnesota has been and is and can be. But people are getting kind of hungrier and more creative. And what is our vision for the future of where the industry is going, and not resting on our laurels? And so that caused us to pull together some actors across the kind of healthcare ecosystem, because one of, speaking just for Medtronic, but likely for many of their peers, one of their observations when they get kind of a vision from another part of the world to build an innovation hub in their region or place, they kind of come back and look at the assets. And one of their observations is, Minnesota has the entire kind of healthcare ecosystem here, not just the medical technology innovator, at that point of innovation. And so how do we put that kind of cocktail together in a way where it's not just things co-located next to each other, but intentionally working together with one strategy? And so last spring, we started to look at that with healthcare providers and insurers and private equity and the state government and our Tier 1 research university here at the University of Minnesota. And we're a couple meetings in, and the U.S. Secretary of Commerce announces this initiative that we had been watching that was part of the CHIPS and Science Act called Tech Hubs. And the premise of Tech Hubs is the federal government, in this kind of unprecedented moment of industrial policy, at least in my lifetime, is saying, we want, as America, to grow our technology leadership in a number of critical areas that are important to the country's national economic competitiveness and national security. And we're looking for America to have a more diversified portfolio of innovation hubs than maybe we've had before. Obviously, everyone knows about the innovation that happens in Silicon Valley or, I mean, a couple other parts of the country, but how can we maybe specialize which hubs of America are going to lead in the next decade and beyond? And there was a premise of how that leadership should happen. It should involve all of those stakeholders I mentioned, all sectors working together to have kind of one strategy that gets to scale. And so we thought, hey, this seems like a really great opportunity. Think about it as an accelerator for an entire region and state, not just one organization, to come up with a vision for the next decade and beyond. And so last summer, we worked really diligently, put together a coalition of a dozen different organizations that were not just kind of raising their hand to endorse the idea of Minnesota growing its leadership, but to say, what would you do differently? University, company, government, whatever firm you are, as part of this bigger strategy. So last fall, we got designated. Minnesota did as one of the technology hubs around the country. So the president announced that in October. We were the only region kind of designated for medical technology, and our focus was really defining kind of what is the future of smart medical technology. So AI/ML enabled medical technology, where is the industry going as that technology advances? I mean, how can Minnesota be the leader in that space? There are many other hubs around the country that folks might be familiar with that are focused on other areas of bio. So I'd point you to look at those too. And then over the last few months, what we've been doing, not just our hub, but other hubs around the country, is we've been kind of racing to put down on paper, what are the first few transformative initiatives that we could implement kind of as a region, as a state in our case, right, to grow our global leadership. And so those run the gamut from looking all the way at the very earliest stages to kind of what is the critical fuel that a smart medtech innovator is going to need. And in America's kind of fragmented, decentralized healthcare system, that's going to be kind of an appetite to get the right data from the right places. And how could we make Minnesota the friendliest place to develop those data agreements with those that have that data? And then a comprehensive suite of kind of startup incubation that connects all of the really great programs that Minnesota has today and others that we could have into one kind of innovator-friendly approach that doesn't put the onus on the entrepreneur to kind of navigate all the different steps, to a comprehensive workforce plan, to at some point in for the conversation for today, a comprehensive infrastructure plan for the future of the region and state, and so on and so forth. And so we're, as of today, kind of biding our time, we and the other tech hubs across the country, waiting to see which hubs the federal government might want to fund first for the initiatives we've come up with. The Congress has only allocated enough funding for the Department of Commerce to pick a few out of the gate as early as this summer, but we're hopeful that more money will be coming. And the Secretary of Commerce is out there going across America, kind of talking to other private financial institutions and foundations and other state governments, kind of trying to rally additional investment behind these strategies. So we're hopeful that we'll have a lot more to kind of share and announce later this year, but that's a little bit of the background, and I think we'll maybe dig into some of the specifics as we go about what does that mean for either an individual worker, what does that mean for a young company, an entrepreneur who's just getting started, what does it mean for some of our largest legacy organizations here in the state of Minnesota. The hope is that it's good for everybody as we kind of concentrate on what is the future of this industry going to need, and how can Minnesota be the best place in the world to provide kind of the environment for that innovation.
Matt, maybe just to piggyback on that and ask a question that may not be answered yet, to your point, kind of waiting on funding timing, but maybe if the answer isn't known, what would be your hope or vision for if you kind of took it down to the project level, once there's a company looking to expand or looking to relocate in the area? Can you speak a little bit more to maybe some of the tools related to site selection? Is it labor analysis? Obviously, the funding piece you mentioned that's potentially forthcoming. How would you actually put some of those into practice?
Yeah, so the Tech Hubs competition is really kind of focused on new technology commercialization. So the kind of premise of the competition was less around the kind of site selection process and more about how are you going to take that kind of idea to scale. So to give you an example, one initiative of the strategy that we would prioritize, that we're asking for funding for, starts with the work that Medical Alley, so we're at a Medical Alley webinar today. So Medical Alley has an initiative called Medical Alley Starts. And in a given year, I might butcher this, but they talk to 1,300, 1,500 different startups around the world, not just in Minnesota, trying to connect them to the ecosystem of assets, professional services, all sorts of things that exist here. Well, that would be a front door where Medical Alley Starts would be talking to a certain number, hundreds of startups per year, whether they're here or want to enter this market. But then after that, they're not just connecting them to the assets that already exist. We would have lined up kind of a series of really intentional accelerators, incubators, really kind of hands-on programming from the University of Minnesota that's walking that innovator through everything from, you know, their first data agreement through the regulatory process, through clinical trials. Everything would kind of be here so that it's quicker, cheaper, easier. None of these are probably some of the hardest things that anybody ever does, right? But as easy as it can be in the global industry to kind of get started. Now, to your question, one of the things we did put in the strategy is if we were awarded and we could kind of start working on these kind of technology commercialization priorities of the federal government, that would kind of give us the momentum to start doing some other things as well. So we put into the proposal that while we haven't scoped this project yet, what we would use some of the federal resources for is to bring together kind of all of Minnesota's players in kind of this site selection space, looking at how does that process work? How do we put together, I think I alluded to this kind of comprehensive long-term infrastructure plan for what this region and state is going to need if we really do aspire to maybe double or triple, right, the amount of innovation that's happening in the industry here. How is that going to happen with our space constraints? But we're not quite kind of to that yet in terms of having that plan.
Yeah, thanks for that response, Matt. And to Jessica's point, we got to knock Orange County out of there, right? I do want to tug on something you said, Jessica, related to the hyperlocal trend. And given the background that Matt just shared on kind of the MedTech side of things, and maybe transition our conversation to a broader life science outlook, so to speak. And what does that niche look like in the Twin Cities area? How is this MedTech that Matt's been talking about play a role in the life science ecosystem in Minnesota? And what do you think is kind of taking shape in the greater Minnesota area, Twin Cities, as it relates to all of this at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. Where to start? So life sciences in the Twin Cities is a unique flower, is the way that I think about it. It's goes back to that original comment I made about the bifurcation of kind of coastal versus non-coastal, and some of these top 5 kind of clusters, like a Boston, a San Diego, San Francisco. Then there's kind of the rising class or like group of cities. And there are some appreciated some days, under recognized areas like MSP, but due to the work of Matt and Greater MSP and Medical Alley, I think that is shifting quite a bit. But part of the reason that it has been a little bit of a challenge is, one, we don't really have an asset class, to Dan's earlier point about it kind of just fits into industrial flex, some office, if you're talking about digital health. And what is under that umbrella, if we're thinking about advanced manufacturing, life science, highly infrastructured lab. And if we're thinking about it in those ways, we have a really interesting mix of agriculture, ag tech. We have a rich and diverse supplier base to feed into that device. The device kind of entire ecosystem is really rich and old and mature. So we have contract manufacturing, CDMOs. We also have a really interesting kind of high-tech chip with the CHIPS money that was just announced with Polar, which was exciting. And we have a huge and diverse food and beverage conversation. So food and ag tech employs together something like 85,000 people around the Twin Cities. And I would say the medical device is somewhere in like 35,000. So we have a really interesting and diverse and base of life science to build from. And because Medtronic started here so long ago in the 50s, right? Our real estate market has grown up alongside of that device market. I think Dan mentioned this earlier. So starting in the 50s, we have 30 million square feet of what we call flex and flex showroom space. So it's this kind of 18 to 24 foot clear, single story, okay parking, solid parking kinds of product that a ton of these smaller startups all the way through to the Medtronics and Boston size use these buildings to do a lot of really interesting R&D manufacturing. And that's one of our interesting kind of underpinnings that other markets in the US just don't have. So understanding, and of course, device and pharma, we do have pharma in this market. It's not as big of a piece, but it is certainly an important piece of our life science ecosystem.
Maybe to add on that, Jessica, I think that was a great description. But what I find is interesting is that the whole flex market conversation, and really historically, those types of buildings were really viewed as kind of negative assets because they didn't have the ceiling height as traditional distribution spaces. They were funky shaped sometime, higher office finish that calls for, sunk costs and higher releasing for these office finishes. Now, almost unintentionally, we've kind of created this base of an asset class that we're now starting to brand life science. That's really getting a buzz, and there's capital behind it, and it's kind of competing with more traditional distribution type spaces that have really been the favorite of capital in the past. And I think of one example that Jackie mentioned in the kickoff. We did a project for Kindeva, which is a business unit spun off of 3M 3.5 years ago. We signed that lease in 2020, and this is in the middle of COVID. They were an essential business. They had this great backstory. 3M retained a meaningful investment in that company, but because it didn't really fit the box of a lot of capital providers, this was probably right on the front end of kind of the whole life science concept coming to our market. And had we leaned into that a little bit more, it would have been a lot easier project to pull off. And we had a lot of challenges with just the overall financing of real estate markets at that time, but uniqueness in terms of high lab build out, a lot of office finish, mezzanine space that made it kind of an albatross in terms of who is the right team that can capitalize this asset. And I think looking forward now, I think we're going to see more of that type of investment in those type of assets being built. And I think they'll be easier because there'll be more projects to comp out. And, you don't want to be the first one in that space and kind of be new to having a highly invested, high basis asset. So the more momentum that builds, I think there'll be more opportunities for similar deals to the Kindeva project.
And just to add on to that a little bit, one of the challenges in our market is a lack of wet lab space and the incredible cost to individual companies. And I think this goes to something that Matt said earlier about infrastructure planning, and this leans into the build to suit world that Jackie lives in, is how do you best support an ecosystem and growing that ecosystem in this market? And some of that is flat out, where are people going to go and how much is it going to cost them to do that? And I think Paul is going to soon join the conversation in a meaningful way to talk about how do we think about these labs. I had a small lab user that we were just trying to find anything that we could put a lab in. And I call it the bubblegum and Band-Aid labs, that a lot of these younger companies, they'll find a corner in like a friendly company's lab, or in this particular company in their existing space, they had to unplug the microscope to plug in the microwave at lunchtime. And so otherwise they'd start blowing fuses all over the place. So we need a better baseline of wet labs for companies like that to step into, because when you're in your early rounds of funding, you don't want to use your friends and family round to build out a beautiful new bench space. So we need as an ecosystem to provide more of that baseline product.
Maybe adding one last thing to that comment, just from a landlord's perspective, when you're coupling new credit with a high cost to build the space, I mean, that's a really tough mix for any landlord, any owner to get comfortable with. So yeah, having some existing product that, isn't new construction and such a large new investment for any space is definitely a requirement, I would say, to kind of the healthy build of the eco space.
And of course, the challenge being that it's not like they just need a room. They often need highly sophisticated equipment and a highly sophisticated build out within that space. And it is definitely one of the challenges that we continue to see for emerging companies to get the type of space and amenities that they need. Paul, I want to pull you in because we're moving towards the building conversation. And so this is your area of expertise. Let's talk a little bit about facilities and emerging possibilities. And Paul, give the audience a little background on what you do and how you work with clients to optimize their space.
Yeah, so principal with Affiliate Engineers. We're a large national engineering consulting firm. We're just doing everything but the structural engineering facilities. So we're partnering with the architects, the structural engineers, owners, developers, right, to understand their needs. And, on the development side, a lot of times that is, a mix of either speculative or, we see that more on the coast, a little bit, in the center of the country, but more of the build to suit, is also where we've seen it. We do a lot of work with universities. And so they're looking for that public-private partnership opportunity. They're trying to find ways for their own, researchers who are launching, something, they want to incubate that and grow it, or bring in private partners. And so, trying to find maybe that sweet spot where they're making the lion's share of that investment as that build to, they're the major anchor tenant. They maybe pay a little bit of a premium, but they are, helping to substantiate like that additional lab space, and even seeing some of the developers offering sort of that, bench. You can rent a single bench or half a bench. So they're trying to find that sort of WeWork type, sort of model that could work to bring in, these new startups, because, they recognize that maybe they want some compressed air, they need some vacuum, they want, some microscopes or other imaging equipment, right? And they're thinking of that as a shared amenity that can be a part of that. So we really do see like a big mix around the country. And it was interesting to hear, Dan and Jessica talking about the flex space, because I feel like there's that suburban kind of, more mature development opportunity where I do feel like the office spaces have bigger floor to floors. I work in a research park in Madison, Wisconsin. And, there's a laboratory incubator building right next door, right? And our buildings look almost exactly the same. And, that becomes a lot easier to retrofit and, maybe make, maybe it's simpler wet lab, clearly the challenges are, was the building designed with enough electrical infrastructure, right? Do you have to upgrade that depending on what you want to offer your tenants? Natural gas, usually that's fine. But then it is, it can be, vibration. So what was the structure originally envisioned to be? If it's an office building, are you limited on what you can do for imaging, perhaps, right? And so maybe, oftentimes though, we just sequester that to the basement or to the grade, the bottom floor, and maybe you still have flexibility then to do other things, on the upper floor. So it is really like an assessment of, what's your market, if it's, CGMP manufacturing or, personalized medicine, that setting maybe isn't going to be kind of the right mark. Maybe that needs to be a more unique space that was built out. But I think there's a lot of flexibility in more of the suburban office setting. And then you get to the urban, I think we've seen that's where the real challenge is. You get the tighter floor to floors, and usually, again, you think, let's say 10 stories, right? That infrastructure, electrical infrastructure just wasn't built. Just even thinking of shipping and receiving, the gases that want to come in, sometimes those become real constraints down at grade level. We see a lot of, biotech, animal research that becomes more constraining in terms of the facilities that might be able to accommodate that. If you have clean space, right, those floor to floors that are, maybe in those older office buildings or more urban office buildings make having clean space much more of a challenge, right? So it becomes things are possible. It's just how many, what are the dollars you're going to spend to make it work?
There are challenges that we've seen in retrofitting. Jessica, you mentioned in our discussion some of the, that's one thing that I think could be an easy thing to point at and say, office. Let's repurpose office. I mean, people are talking about repurposing it into multifamily, basically repurposing into anything else but office. But my question is, Paul, it sounds like you've seen that happen successfully depending on the building. Jessica, are you also seeing that here in the Twin Cities? And what's that path been like?
Yeah, we've had it's been an interesting kind of up and down, as you might imagine, with life science conversion conversations. I'd say in our market, a lot of folks own buildings and office buildings that they don't see a great future for. But our experience so far is that because we have all of this flex space, that's still going to be a way easier, less costly, and from an investor point of view, makes actual sense. Whereas if you're using half the floor or every other floor for interstitial space of a pretty outdated office building, that isn't something that this market has been able to get its arms around. We haven't even really been able to get a spec lab building off the ground yet. I think that's coming, but I'd say this is a very different market from that perspective than like a Boston, where right at the end of the crazy run in Boston, they were converting like a WeWork into a lab, and just the sheer dollars that it takes to do that doesn't make financial sense. The numbers don't work in this market to do conversions like that when you can just go grab an industrial building and make it a lab.
I'd add, that we don't have the land scarcity or the density, that drives it as well. There's still second-tier suburbs, third-tier suburbs with plenty of greenfield opportunities too that make it a lot easier financially just to go out versus going up.
That does make sense in this market. I suppose that would be a trend that's going to be more directed towards dense urban markets rather than Minneapolis, though we have an urban core. We do, as you say, Dan, have a lot of additional space outside of that core. Let's talk a little bit about amenities and space. Paul, you're working with users to optimize their operations, to enhance their space. What amenities are you seeing today's user look for? What's emerging? Jessica, I'd have you probably add to that as well in terms of what you're seeing among your clients and their use needs.
Yeah, I'd definitely say, we've seen a mix of, food, fitness, a lot of kind of different meeting space types and sizes, right, to accommodate different, just different needs, different events, in those public-private settings, really trying to create a dynamic public space where, there's different areas or types, to work in different settings, whether that's couches, high tops, really trying to bring collisions, right? I mean, that is the kind of MO with architects and with developers, is trying to create collisions between all the different stakeholders that are in those facilities. So, we've seen it where they're cutting, connectivity between floors, trying to get maybe cafes on every other floor, or, the kitchenettes, so that people are kind of drawn in, within those spaces. So, they are sharing space on a floor, but trying to get two floors to mix more frequently. So I've seen that. And then, in terms of the optimization, seen it on fintech and starting to see some developers on the life science dabble with it, but would be, an app, where you can schedule those rooms, you could potentially order food, maybe have actually some control over your thermostat. So just trying to create an enhanced user experience. And then to some extent, by seeing where people are using space, then from optimizing the energy side of it, or even cleaning, shutting down, certain areas, or saying, hey, no one was there today, don't bother cleaning. So, when you get to a larger scale building, trying to think of different ways to really improve operational efficiency.
Yeah, from an amenities point of view, again, this goes back to the kind of tale of two two worlds in the lab space and these sorts of like really specific life science buildings, you need really basic things like conference rooms and a place for folks to go that isn't their lab to eat lunch. And some places, there's always office attached to the lab. You can't just grab a lab in it. And then I'd say I totally echo Paul's point about collaboration, and these common spaces and some of these lab incubator type buildings where collaboration is the goal are beautiful. I mean, they're just like gorgeous, like plants and light and coffee and events and programming. And that's on that kind of almost incubator, startup, build the company place. There's also the exact opposite where I'd say security is just bananas and you've got to know somebody who knows somebody really well to even walk in the lobby, and that's it. You're not allowed anywhere else on the floor. It's a secret who's in there. I will be curious once we hit this kind of drop off of new supply coming online at the end of this year, what the next phase of amenities looks like, because the cost of your building goes up with the more common space you have. And so where is that right balance? And I think that balance will continue to evolve in the next kind of tranche of developments.
Yeah, I agree with all that, Jessica and Paul. The other comment I would add is I think scale is a factor too. We've done a couple of larger, more regional headquarters style projects. Obviously, Boston side we mentioned in Maple Grove, but also outside of Denver for Medtronic. Both were north of 1,000 employees coming to the space every day. And what we're seeing in those instances is kind of like the old office complex amenities of the past. But I feel like our users are more confident in making those investments because people have to be in the building working versus the work from home flexibility. So in those two instances, anyways, we're seeing really robust amenities. I mean, even in Boston Sci's case, childcare, robust food service, game rooms, fitness. I mean, it's really really impressive, and obviously they want that to be a draw for their employees and their customers and stakeholders as well. So it's kind of a showpiece in that regard. But you wouldn't see that obviously in any smaller scale projects, but for kind of the larger scale campus oriented projects, we're seeing those really robust offerings.
That almost feels like we're coming back round to like the 90s when everybody was in the office. And so there was childcare, there was fitness centers. And then I think we all went to this kind of scaled down, more open concept thing. Then the pandemic, then nobody came in. And it seems like now possibly that next trend is to re-amenitize and really make the work experience more holistic. And it'll be interesting to see that. So I want to do a quick pause and say to the audience, we would love your questions, so please put them in the Q&A function. I would like the panelists to answer one question, and while we allow participants to put in some of their questions, crystal ball, what do we look out and see for the next 3 to 5 years for, when we're talking about life sciences, what we think is happening in Minnesota and maybe nationwide. Jessica, you've talked a little bit about what's going to happen when we kind of, absorb all the space that's available in this market. But as we look out to the next, say, 3 to 5 years, what do you more or less predict for this subset of the market? Matt, could start with you.
Sure. Two things I think, just looking at the last few months are any indicator. One is I think our doubling down on telling the world that we are Medical Alley, the global epicenter of health innovation and care. We've had countries from across the world reaching out really over the last couple months, seeing the federal government say, yeah, this is America's tech hub for MedTech, interested in figuring out how can they establish a more kind of permanent connection to this place, beyond even just kind of the visiting that they already do. And so how they might show up, where they might show up, what that might mean for companies that end up with a presence in our space, I think is something to watch. The second thing is having this kind of bigger picture strategy where we connect all of the great assets we have. I think how our spaces are networked with each other is something that's really interesting. So we've seen some real kind of intentional dialogue between, for example, like the destination medical center and things happening at the University of Minnesota campus, or different things happening in different parts of the metro that you might be in that space most of the time, but you could kind of get visibility and access to other parts of the region. So we have, as part of our proposal, that there would kind of be almost like an embassy approach, that you could be on soil in one organization's space, but be connected to a lot of other spaces. So kind of interested to see how that develops as well.
Matt, one other quick question from the audience. How might the strategy for MedTech 3.0 bring funding resources from the coast closer and resident in Minnesota?
Yeah,
any thoughts there?
So one of the projects which is called the MedTech Funding Frontier, was designed by several kind of leading venture capital firms. Vensana is an example of a firm that's based here that's really engaged in the space. The idea is, if you just look at the national trends, that kind of early stage investment, capital has been moving a little bit later, a little bit less risky, and so that kind of valley of death has grown a little bit. And so our focus has been, by showing the strategy that we have that's going to basically kind of lower the costs and lower the risk a bit for that innovator. We want to go nationally to anybody who's deploying capital, or globally in that space, and really make a compelling case for why Minnesota is going to be the most effective and cost-efficient place to do medical technology innovation. But we also are going to bring that message to individual and institutional investors that might be agnostic to any kind of technology area, and really kind of deploy more capital into this industry, from kind of off the sidelines of medical technology kind of venture capital today, as well as look at, like, what are some of the policy incentives that might kind of incentivize more early stage capital. There's all sorts of other things, like, the more that we can do to even just add more grant writing capacity to go after non-dilutive federal funding, that it already exists, it's going to go somewhere, and the more that innovators could have access to free resources to lock down more of that funding. So it's kind of an all hands on on deck approach. So it's a really great question.
Yeah, thanks Matt. Dan, anything from Ryan Capital team on that one that you want to chime in with, or did Matt pretty much sum it up?
Well, I think, again, it shows where my scope, just as a developer and builder, much more, small versus kind of the big picture problems that Matt and team are solving. I go to the individual building asset investment, and I think it's a similar trend. There's going to be, in my opinion, there's going to be more groups, more landlords, more capital sources willing to put more money into the facilities, because they're listening to these groups that want to use their hard-earned capital for their business and equipment and employees. And I think that's a differentiator. If you're willing to invest more into the facility, you kind of buy into the story a little bit, take some credit risk on the tenant's behalf, and get comfortable with kind of the price per pound increase that I think all these companies need. So I think it's just kind of an extension of what Matt was saying, in terms of more capital funding to the clients themselves, and then subsequently to the assets in the buildings.
Fantastic. Well, maybe one other quick question, and Dan, maybe you can chime in. Jessica, I think you might have some insight into this, and then Matt, you as well. But incentives aside, what is the potential sales pitch to life science clients coming to the, call it, Twin Cities area? What does that look like?
Great developers, easy.
That's why I started with you, Dan.
That was a layup, Dan. I don't know. I would guess Jessica and Matt are better positioned to answer this, but where my head goes is talent, resources, public amenities, green space, parks, education. I think that magic mix, Fortune 5s that are in the area already. I think that story is pretty established, but there's probably more nuance Matt and Jessica may be able to weigh in on.
I mean, I'm happy to jump in. I mean, it's definitely talent. And when you look at, a company, especially if you're looking to place a center of excellence or kind of do your innovation work, obviously The cost at which you do that is a really important consideration, and we're probably not the lowest cost place, right, in the country or in the world. But when you're doing that type of work, you want to do it well. And so the concentration of talent that's here, this isn't specific to the medical technology space, but I think some of us on the phone are familiar with this book that the strategy professor at the Carlson School of Management, Miles Shaver, put together, kind of showing that professional talent kind of here in this headquarters economy has stuck here at the highest rate. And part of that's been part of the special sauce. And so if the talent across your value chain is in a place, you kind of need to be there. And that's been our secret. It's also not a secret, though, that, you know, that the demographics of America are changing, the Midwest are changing, that Minnesota is changing. And so we really have to be aggressive at making sure that we hold that position of having that differentiated talent base. And so that means being kind of really creative across all of our educational institutions and training institutions, and as employers on how we're kind of upskilling folks. So we want to keep our foot on the gas on that, but it historically has been workforce. That's what we hear from employers as they make those decisions.
I mean, the one thing I'd add to that, Matt, so, you know, I'm working on a development project in Sacramento, right, which is outside of South San Francisco. You know, it's a few hours away or a couple hours away, and you know, you've got that desire we see in second and third tier cities. They're trying to develop, right, life science hubs, but they know they need the training ground. So, like you said, like needing to think of educating, because if you want the whole industry to grow in the Twin Cities, you still need to have the people there that are there, you know, whether it's bachelor's degree science or tech degrees, to be able to operate those labs and those facilities, right? You've got to keep that pipeline growing. Otherwise, there just won't be the people, and you'll have to seed that to these other markets that are, you know, up and coming and trying to compete.
And I would just add to that, the sales pitch for the Twin Cities, the expertise of the labor across the board, but also the expertise of the other companies inside the ecosystem. So if you need the best lawyers to get your product through the FDA approval and you've got a sticky wicket somewhere in there, they're here. If you need a facility that has some build out, that's some existing infrastructure, we've got facilities here. We've got affordable enough facilities. It's not the cheapest thing in the entire world, but it's also a much more cost effective. And when you tie cost effective real estate to the labor and expertise that we have here, if you can't get the person, to Matt's point, if you can't get a body to push the button or run the machine or whatever, that hourly tech work, but also all the way through to the PhD level, you know, biochemist. If you can't get those, it doesn't matter what your real estate costs and what your other costs are. And that's one of the key pieces that we have here, along with the top 10 research organization in the University of Minnesota. We have not mentioned Mayo Clinic yet, but we should. The innovation corridor, the mix that was just announced by the University of Minnesota, will be a really interesting innovation focus for the region for a long time. Mayo just announced the Hospital of the Future, and what is that, $4 billion of investment going in an hour south of us here. We consider it to be a super region in some ways. So kind of tying all of the bow on what we have going on here, quality of life for your employees is also a huge factor in a lot of conversations that we're having post-COVID, really, in a way that we didn't. And the future of our region, I think, is incredible. There's an incredible amount of opportunity here, and companies should come here and be a part of an ecosystem that's incredibly supportive and welcoming.
Great. I'm gonna pull a slightly longer conversation or question that was just put into the chat, and I think that we have a good group to answer it. So the question is, certain but particularly larger medtech biotech users have either a mandate or desire to prioritize environmental stewardship, whether it's developing new assets that are net zero ready or electrifying existing assets. To what extent is this a topic, helpful or hurtful, in venture capital, private equity, developer leasing conversations when evaluating the future of real estate in this space? Given this industry has a tendency to be high energy consumers, and our region is generally lower energy cost as compared to the coast, has this been a topic when incentivizing expansion or relocation to our region? And I would say, I want you guys to answer that, but I think we're seeing more of a challenge like with data center users coming in and snatching up that cheap power more so than medtech users, and the use or the need for power is way outsized compared to even probably like the highest consumer of energy in the medtech space. But Paul or Jessica, how are you seeing, are we incentivizing companies to come here and then they snatch up all the cheap power, or what is that dynamic looking like?
I guess I'm not as close to the Twin Cities markets. I don't know, Jessica, if you have thoughts on the pressure or this, interest there for the companies relocating, or how it's being incentivized or encouraged.
Yeah, I think power is incredibly important. I mean, there's no ifs, ands, or there's no way around that. If you can't get your power and you can't meet your peak requirements on a cost-effective basis. And if you don't have, and so like, I feel like that gets coupled in my conversations a lot with the speed to market around what kind of infrastructure in any sort of build to suit, how fast can we get this thing to market? Because every day that I'm not operational is a real problem. And that is something that power and how close is the power and how much power can you get feeds into that conversation.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head, Jessica. That the key point for me was build to suit, in that you're not seeing developers and landlords take this on unilaterally. It has to be driven by a tenant. And I think purely that's cost prohibitive. I don't think in our little world, I don't think we've seen a meaningful lease up or rent premium or anything that would otherwise incentivize landlords to do that on a speculative basis. However, speaking for Ryan, more than happy to do that with our customers as kind of the impetus behind it. But truly, it's that the market is not there yet in terms of making some of those provisions, or setting your buildings up for carbon zero or any of these other features. That would be an outlier to the market today.
It's yet very new here, and even our capacity to do it and do it in any way that's economically feasible is sort of yet in the future. So we are at time. I want to say thank you to each of our panelists, and thank you to Medical Alley for partnering to put on this webinar, and thank you to our participants for joining. Tyler, I will turn it over to you for the close.
Absolutely. Well, thank you again, everybody, for tuning into today's webinar. Thank you to our panel and our moderators, and to Ryan Companies for putting on today's webinar. I hope everybody enjoyed the conversation. Just a reminder, this is recorded, so within a day or so, you'll receive a link to the recording of this. Feel free to share that with your colleagues or anyone else who might be interested. One last note, we do have another upcoming webinar on June 5th titled Scaling Success in Medical Device and Biotech, Navigating ERP for Growth and Funding. That's presented by Business Solution Partners. So again, that's June 5th. You can find that and all of our upcoming webinars and events at medicalalley.org/events. If anyone has questions that weren't answered today during the call, feel free to reach out to me, tmason@medicalalley.org, and I can help navigate with the panelists, and we can answer any questions you have. Until then, I hope everyone has a great rest of your day, and thanks again for tuning in. Take care, everybody.